Welcome, everyone, to a monthly Eckerson Group webinar. We're glad to have you here. The topic for today is optimizing Power BI performance and utilization. So, yours truly, Wayne Eckerson, is the moderator here. We have two fantastic speakers, very experienced in Power BI and all things data. Carlos Bossi, CEO of DataLear, and David Booth, who's a data engineering and BI manager also at DataLear. DataLear is one of Eckerson Group's premier partners that help us deliver data strategies for companies big and large, commercial and nonprofit. So we're glad to have them with us today. So just a little bit about Eckerson Group. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps commercial and nonprofit organizations get more value from their data. We specialize in delivering actionable data strategies, roadmaps, and governance programs. And you can see some of our clients here in the screen. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Carlos and David to take us through the best practices they've learned in using Power BI and getting the most out of it based on a lot of engagements they've had with various clients over the years. So, Carlos, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks a lot, Wayne. Like Wayne said, I'm Carlos Bossi, and I run DataLear. And we this presentation is going to be about based on real world examples. Real work we've done with our clients that often we might start with an assessment or they want to use Power BI better, and so we dive deep into how they're using Power BI and ultimately make it more efficient, more cost effective, and certainly more valuable to the organization. So much of this will be based on the approach we take during an assessment and the kind of things we look at. So why don't we go to the next slide, Wayne, and I'll talk a little bit about DataLear and who we are. DataLear is a data and analytics company. We develop data solutions, and our staff has deep expertise in this area. We can develop actionable data strategies and roadmaps, strong data management practices, and we build solutions for companies in all industries. As you see on the left-hand side, we can do data architecture, advanced analytics, data engineering, governance strategy, and so on. And it's all about making data more valuable for you and giving you the data you need when you need it and the way you need it.
Thanks, Carlos. I'll kind of get us started here. So obviously, this webinar is really going to focus on optimizing Power BI and performance and utilization. And my role at David Booth as the manager of BI and data engineering is to take a look really under the hood of many of our clients and help solve their data problems. And a lot of times we see that issues are throughout the whole architecture, but also things are doing right. But people have challenges using Power BI as the tool that they have selected. And so we've come in and assessed Power BI, and we have an approach that we take. So the first bit of this webinar is we'll walk you through our steps of how we assess Power BI. And in a sense that really we need to emphasize utilization to be able to have performance next. So I'll talk about how we get to assess Power BI. Talking really into the architecture of Power BI is how do we design our workspaces and manage that so that users have all types of users can access the data when they need it, where they need it. We'll go into some deep dives of simplifying golden data sets or semantic models for self-service, discussing dimensional models and just semantic model best practices. We'll go into some detail about Power BI applications and how that can really simplify consumption. And last but not least is monitoring your tenancy. So Wayne, if you want to jump into the next screen, we'll get started. So obviously a big part of our role here at DataLear is we're trying to understand our clients' challenges. We want to make data as easily and as simple to access as possible. And oftentimes when we get into a new client, we hear many common issues with Power BI. One, it's too slow, or we have too many workspaces with little governance. We don't know where to really even begin. How does an analyst know where to go? So really the next is, or there's too many duplicate reports that are all saying the same thing. The numbers are slightly different, with data sets that are inconsistent or calculated differently. So which is the right data set? And so throughout many of our experiences is really how do we set that standard for that source of truth? And really understanding it. Or an often problem, and when you talk about performance, is it takes too long to refresh our semantic model, so we don't use it. We have to go to other sources of data. So really assessing those problems and steps to get there. And then the last two is really security, access, and that single source of truth. So how do we get there, and what are some real life examples of kind of the approach we're going to take to assess your Power BI environment? Wayne, if you go to the next screen here, the next slide, we take a four-step approach. So really, before I dive into these 4 steps of how we're going to assess your Power BI tendency, I'd like to take a high-level approach on this. Really, we've seen with real-life clients is that really you have to take Power BI as a whole as an architecture beyond just looking at the data itself. How are you going to manage your workspace? How are you going to design your Power BI architecture so that it's easy for users to access the data they need and when they need it? How are you going to provide data to analysts and report consumers in the right way so it's simple? So how are you going to design your semantic models? Then how are you going to build? So build the implementation of the model, the report, and where you set up that functionality. So really where we're going to go here is we're going to first talk about how we're going to manage your workspace. How are we going to, how many workspaces do you have? So for one example, during this assessment, we came in and this organization had over 1,000 workspaces. Well, they were organized in ways that we thought were successful. It was becoming too tedious to manage that. So how do we look at user access and management of workspaces and remove those? So we'll first take a look at that as a high level. The next step is where's your data coming from and how is your data getting connected? So we're going to take a look at your golden data sets or your semantic models, and really try to understand, okay, what is the modeling technique you're using for your performance? Are you having bugs? Identify solutions where maybe one data set can be the source of truth for many reports instead of a single report. And really ensure, and I think the most important part of that is ensuring the data sets align with the business needs and are optimized to answer those questions. A lot of the times we see when we look into semantic models or golden data sets is they're trying to do too much with that. So really meeting with the business and organizing how does your golden data set meet the needs of what the reporting need, can answer many reports, but also is not trying to do the whole enterprise. At DataLayer, we've seen success when we focus on a single use case. I'll go into more details about this in future slides, but one of our pharmaceutical clients, we first started with the golden data set of sales. Obviously, that's a large topic, but how can we slice and dice sales by a specific region? By maintaining a specific workspace for single access on that, but also setting up semantic models that really answer one question and can feed 20 to 50 reports, we were able to focus on one and then build on to more detail from there. Once we've analyzed the golden data sets and the semantic models that are being used, we look at performance optimization. What DAX is being used? What is the query? How are you accessing the data? Are you writing queries for every table within your semantic model? Or are you focused on trying to create one tabular? Are you using Power BI as an ETL tool when it really should be that semantic virtual reporting tool? And probably the question that everyone has on here is what storage methodology are you using? And it's an age-old question of direct query versus import mode. We'll go into a bit more detail on that and experience we have seen with that. And then analyze the options for things such as advanced features, aggregate refreshes, incremental loads, and things like that. But our first step is analyzing what are you doing now, figuring out what's working and what's not working. And last but not least, we're going to take a look at your system resource utilization. Many users have Power BI per capacity, which is the highest tier, which you have your own dedicated server for this. We want to analyze what is being used, how your refreshers are using that compute, but also looking at your resource utilization if you're not in that tier of Power BI. What does it take to refresh a semantic model? Are users is there a latency issue with your data having to refresh locally on your own desktop before republishing, and monitoring this to ensure optimal performance for reports. We take these 4 different approaches. One to say, okay, how are you accessing your data? How is the data being formed? And then really looking at what's being used and how people are using the data. Through that, we're able to come up with really how can we solve these issues for you? And this is there's many approaches to this. So in our findings, and if Wayne, if we want to jump over to the next slide, what we're going to say and what we're going to summarize to get to your findings, and this is where I can provide some real life situations, is we're going to report your current Power BI practices. In our times, we've seen that many organizations actually are successful in many aspects of Power BI. They've organized their workspaces to be by department or by initiative, and that is successful if they're consistent with that workspace management. They've created that single source of truth with a golden data set, but struggle to deploy users to that. So really, we've seen success, but we're also going to report on what's struggling. We're going to create a dashboard of how many workspaces you have, how many reports you have. And so for one example, through this metadata of Power BI, we were able to determine, while an organization had the right number of workspaces, they were creating one data set for every report. That made the challenge of maintaining your data much more challenging, inconsistency in how calculations are created. And so through these findings, we were able to come up with actionable recommendations for optimizations. We determined, hey, this is how we can get to that single source of truth for maybe turn 100 semantic models into 20 or 5, and look at your data model and say, okay, this approach of your modeling will work to solve your solution. For one example, we took that 1,000 data sets and cut it almost in half, and then set a plan of how we can take that other 500 and create it into fewer, so you can have that true golden data set. And through that, we know that getting to that final solution or that optimal solution can be challenging. So we create that roadmap for implementing practices. First, let's clean up your artifacts, get rid of unused workspaces or unused reports or unused semantic models to narrow it down and get that, what we would say, low hanging fruit out of the way. And then we can continue to fine tune and plan for that. And last but not least is training and enabling our analytics team. I think a big issue in our findings is, while organizations have set up Power BI properly and have semantic models ready to be used, it's enabling your team and teaching your team on how to connect to that semantic model and doing the analysis you need, or the training to access the reports you need. So providing those details on lunch and learns, or training your data engineering team on how to access that. For an example, we used as chief operating officer I was working with was spending hours building a sales report, taking all their data from different sources, and through Power BI, we were able to bring that into one single source of truth. And we enabled them, the COO, to build their sales report directly in Power BI and save a lot of time through that. So really what we find successful is, once we've trained you, you obviously set that training culture within your organization to teach users how to really get the data they need. I'm going to use Excel to pull this data from my semantic model, and it can work. And really, you enable that self-service data culture. And we have found that really can drive the success. So Wayne, I want to open up really on the first bit of the assessment to questions. Carlos or Wayne, do you guys have questions on anything I've addressed, or is the audience out there?
I was going to add something there, is that, you kind of heard David say this, and if you're going to do this yourself, there's there's a lot of data to be gathered so you can do a proper assessment. And so what we've done is we've developed a system that produces a dashboard that can show you a lot of data about how you're using Power BI, how many workspaces you have, how many semantic models, what's the ratio of reports to semantic models. All that information tells you a lot about your data. So one of the suggestions I have, especially if you go off and do this yourself, is don't try to automate some of that and make use of the data that's already being captured in the system. Power BI does a pretty good job of logging everything. There's other ways to capture some of that data, and then that way you can get really good information about your environment and make good decisions about it.
Now that seems to me like a report that Microsoft should put in the box of Power BI so that it's available to everyone. It would be in their own best interest, right, to have people optimize the use of Power BI. But let me just remind the audience, I'm sure a lot of you folks have experience with Power BI. You have your own best practices. So if you think it's appropriate, add those in here. If you are struggling with something in Power BI, put your question in there, and this team's at your disposal to address your needs and answer your questions. So one question I have for both of you guys is, there's a lot of variables that contribute to suboptimal performance with Power BI. What is the one thing or the biggest thing that you see that organizations can change or do better to improve their Power BI performance?
Well, I can take a shot first, and then maybe David can take his. But I think a lot of work. Power BI is a really good tool to pull in data quickly, right? You have data that's in your enterprise, and you need to bring in additional data, and it makes it easy to do, and it makes it easy to relate the data, connect the data. And that's one of its powerful features. But that feature is also one of the detriments to how people often use it. They have data in the enterprise that isn't exactly the way they want it, right? It isn't the way they need it to look. So what they do is they do a lot of work in Power BI to transform that data, to model it, to aggregate it, to relate it to other tables. There's a lot of complex stacks, maybe written, a lot of complex code. They add columns on demand. So all of that slows down performance, load times. It makes it slower to perform or harder to maintain. And often some of that, the approach would be that some of that work should be moved to other parts of the enterprise, before the data is loaded to Power BI, or it should be modeled differently. And so ultimately people get themselves into trouble because you do have the power of being able to do that, but there's an appropriate time to do that and then an appropriate time not to. And sometimes a lot of work is done at the front end of the tool, whereas some of that work could be shifted over to other places, maybe in your source databases or somewhere else in your pipelines.
Yeah, that's a tough temptation for business people, right? They have an
No,
itch,
yeah.
and they have to
Yeah.
scratch it, and Power BI is a really good back scratcher.
It is a tough temptation, but it's also, I think, a powerful part of it is that I don't have to wait for IT to bring in additional data. If I have that ability to do it myself in some way, I can get that work done today. So it's something that needs to be open and exposed, but also managed properly and governed properly.
Yeah, governance is key here, or else you'll have chaos in a Tower of Babel. So, David, what is the one thing that you see companies do wrong that would improve their performance?
And you'll hear me say this throughout the presentation, but I think it's creating that one data set for one report. They'll create, maybe they have a data model that answers a lot of their questions, but each report is referencing that own connection to that database. And that creates performance issues because you're now managing 100 semantic models where you need to manage refreshes and maintain data in 100 spots, whereas a single source of truth or those fewer data sets allow for easier management and governance of that, and allow, again, to Carlos's point, if you have 3 trusted data sets, that power user can still go in and add their reference data that they may not have been able to add to the database yet. But you're now not creating different ways of accessing the same information 100 times. And so I think when I go into organizations and I see that they're creating almost a data set for every report, one, it becomes a maintenance nightmare. And 2, you're utilizing refresh powers on Power BI more than you really need to. So
Yeah. And what's the point of having a data warehouse or a backend data lake if you're just using it to run reports, modeling it, in a report-centric way instead of modeling it for reuse. Hey, we've got a lot of comments and questions already, so let me go through these. So Matthew makes a comment. His suggestion is make as much transformation upstream through SQL data engineering. That could make DAX much easier after and speed up the report.
So that comment is, I think, what I was trying to say as well. I think as much as you can move transformation work upstream. Again, sometimes in some organizations that can be difficult and delay. It needs to be done by an engineer often,
Yeah.
but it can delay your work. But I think that's a really good comment, something to really balance in your approach.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan has a tough question here. Do you keep user-facing Power BI artifacts in workspaces that are separate from data workspaces? Can you please describe the high-level approach touching on the medallion data architecture?
Dan, that's a really good question. I've actually seen it in organizations that do both. And it really depends on how you really have defined your data users at your organization. Where I found it successful of keeping data sets in a specific workspace versus reports in a specific use space, it was a really large organization and they wanted to maintain security access to who had access to a single data set, who could build the reports. And I found that successful. However, if you're kind of that more agile organization that wants to enable users to build reports, deploy reports, you may give them access to that semantic model workspace and combine it, have a workspace that's more specific to maybe the semantic model it is, and allow reports and data sets to live in the same workspace. I often say this is probably not the answer you want to the question. It depends. What makes sense for how you want to maintain access to data from your users. I'll get into more details about applications and report applications, but that can allow for kind of that delta there is maybe you have a single workspace from data workspaces and report works user facing space, but users who are just accessing reports use application Power BI apps instead of just the workspaces, and it makes consumption much easier.
And I can touch on the medallion architecture, because when we do have the opportunity to build the data architecture, which most often we do, because it's one of the strengths of our company, or to at least influence the data architecture, we always build a data architecture with a medallion type of architecture or a variation of the approach. But having a gold and silver and bronze zones or bronze areas to where you can get different types of maybe the same data in different ways is a really important approach to doing it right. Most people, I think, when they're using Power BI would use gold data. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Data that's curated and modeled for Power BI. But even silver and bronze data could be important, especially for more advanced users.
All right, let's take one more question here. This is from Whitney, who's a Power BI administrator. How did or do you try to identify which data set semantic models that already exist in your tenant today really are similar enough could be brought into one semantic model used by multiple reports? Good question.
Great question. Great question, Whitney. And that was actually something we saw with the organization that had, I think, 1,000 something data sets. We first narrowed it down by workspace. They had region-based sales workspaces with each report using one semantic model. Even though each semantic model for each report was slightly different, the measures and metrics used in those reports were similar enough that we could recommend an approach to combine that into a single source of truth. Use your dimensional model to the fullest and should be able to answer those questions. However, it takes you're often going back and forth with the business, especially in areas where we're coming in to understand how that semantic model might need to be enhanced to answer more questions or more reporting needs.
Okay, so great questions, great comments, folks. Keep them coming in. but we're going to move on for now. So let's go to the next slide. Talk about workspace design management.
Yeah, and I think Wayne, I think we'll continue to answer these questions, but many of these questions of what Dan asked earlier, how do you manage workspaces? This is obviously organization specific, and I would say set a practice and how you want to do it at your organization. We often say workspaces should be organized by a single content department or project. So again, when I said content, does it make sense to have a data sets workspace? Set that pattern so that you can then say, I'm going to follow this pattern. Where we've seen troubles is there's inconsistencies with it. There's department workspaces, there's project workspaces, and there's content workspaces. By setting a single pattern that we're going to do department-based workspaces, it simplifies the solution. It allows developers and report users to know exactly where that's going to go. I say workspace should consist of few or no data sets. So again, that answer goes back to the question asked earlier, is workspace are really that file organization or content organization area based on how your organization wants to do it. So say you have a finance workspace, I would recommend maybe your finance data set there and all your finance reports live there. However, that same finance report can live in executive reports as well, as if that's where you want to create that analytical place. This is where you have to kind of define, do I want a single department or do I want content specific? And that has to be almost in the governance practices of your organization on what you find suited best. We just think trying to keep it consistent makes it easier and when to know to create a new workspace. Really, this is one that also I find is the best way to enable both consumption of reports, but also users. Managing access, simplify your Power BI environment by limiting access to who actually can use it. So for example, in an organization that I worked in, I was the data engineer and I was only able to I had access to the workspace to publish my semantic models, publish my reports. However, end users, the business users did not have access to that workspace because they didn't need to see what was actually in it. That was the technical area, and it allowed for simple usage of where to go find the data where you need it. So I always say, try to limit your workspace access to power users, i.e. the people building the semantic models, building reports, data set developers, and analysts, UA analysts, maybe you have a dev workspace. Another challenge we saw is maintaining the security side of workspaces. This is more on the admin side, but use Entra or AD security groups to manage that access to your workspace. So in that scenario, have a security group of developers that have access to the workspace and can see all the artifacts. But there may be someone who only needs to have access to the reports. You can limit that, or you make them viewers. So really, instead of controlling it on a one-off basis, leverage your security infrastructure to set that. And then really lastly here is when to have that conversation to create new workspaces. I often said, I'm using the project example here. If a new project comes up and it's that new analytical space, create that area for it. However, if you're doing the department base, you're oftentimes not seeing new departments spun up very often. Another issue which we often have come upon is they really want to lock down role level security is not answering their questions. Sensitive HR data or sensitive finance data needs to be locked down to such a small subset of data users. Set the rules in place to access that. Specific audiences, security level where maybe all developers or maybe all parts of the organization have no access. So that's really like workspaces. Try to maintain that, and I'm going to go into some more details on maintaining that. But obviously, people are going to probably asking, okay, well, if I have one workspace, say for finance, there's a lot of reports out there. You can organize your workspace with subfolders. Power BI recently came up with that, but also maintain monitoring. And so tools that we'll go over and we kind of talked about in our assessment, leveraging the tools to understand who's using what so you can remove artifacts is an important part. Workspaces can get messy and quickly as reports die. So continuing to monitor those workspaces and who's using what and archiving old reports is a significant and important way to do that. So Wayne, I think we can open up some questions. I've
Yeah.
seen some questions on that.
Yeah, actually, a lot of questions on semantic model, but we're going to get to that next. A couple on workspaces. So one from, actually two from Jesse. Wouldn't creating new workspaces based on projects create the excess of workspaces? Projects come and go, whereas content department should be fairly stable.
Jesse, great question. And I agree with that. And that's really, how do you want to manage or do the admin on your Power BI side of things? Do you want to continuously remove workspaces that as they come and go with projects? Maybe projects isn't the workspace methodology for you. It's really just setting that pattern that makes sense for how your organization wants to run. Content department is definitely more stable and often what we see in most organizations implementing.
Jesse also asks, are these workspace recommendations based on the assumption that a client is using apps as well? We found that apps didn't integrate with internal tool, and so we are having to consider different design of workspaces.
That is definitely where my assumption's going, and we're going to assess Power BI apps later in this presentation. But yes, because an app sits on top of a specific workspace, and so you can create that subset of reports from the application. So for finance, you might have a handful of reports. I can then now make the consumption just go on the app side. However, challenges with embedding those in internal tools, embedding those tools can make challenges with applications, and then you do need to govern your workspaces slightly different.
Okay. Carlos, any comments before we move on?
No, I think we're good to go.
Okay.
We had one more question come in, Wayne,
Oh,
on data sets.
Workspaces should consist of no data set, then where to store the data set?
So if you're using the methodology, and I can go pretty quickly here, the technique where I've seen this successful, where there's workspace just strictly for reports, your workspace pattern or organization will have a specific workspace for data sets. It's just taking the difference between a reports workspace, say finance reports, and then Semantic, we call it golden data sets in a specific, and that's where all your data sets live.
Okay. All right, let's move on to semantic models here, a very important topic. A lot of questions already on that.
So obviously, self-service is a huge part of where I find Power BI can be successful. And that starts with building the right semantic model. However, most users of a semantic model that aren't the users who are technical, they need to be set up right. So in this example, we're using a dimensional model, which we have found to be one of the most successful ways to build that self-service semantic model. Techniques that I have found that have benefited and simplified self-service are, instead of relying on complex DAX such as use relationship, we create specific tables for role-playing dimensions. My example often is date. Oftentimes, a single fact table will have multiple dates. And so we recommend creating that dimension table, or repeating that date dimension table multiple times to then be able to set up that unique relationship within the semantic model. But also to start, as you're kind of building out your self-service, this example here is for a company that we worked with that had no self-service. They didn't have an engineering team or a BI team, and so we came in and helped them set this up, and we wanted to start small. So when we build out semantic models, we really focus on a use case specific to start. So this example was sales. We had a fact sales and several supporting dimensions, and we wanted to really start with the semantic model, a small semantic model, so that users could gain the comfort. And so we set up all those specific date tables. I think they had facilities, so that was another role-playing dimension. But again, that use case allows for simple self-service that allows users to gain comfort and then gain the knowledge as we add facts or more data tables. Another piece of advice as we build out semantic models is avoid calculated columns. Again, in small letters, you say time and place, because as Carlos mentioned, it's a benefit and a challenge with Power BI's. Sometimes you need a column or you need data added to your semantic model where the IT team can't get that there quickly. So you can use calculated columns to derive data that you need in given spaces. However, that's going to take up resources, calculated resource. That's going to use more resources on refresh, and calculated columns only work on refresh. So they're not dynamic. You can't change things to get those to work in a reporting layer. It's more or less a slight ETL solution, and it can answer your question. I generally say avoid, because those can create complexities and refresh, slow down performance. If possible, push that upstream in your data engineering side. Next, I always say build measure tables. Our goal here is to try to simplify usage. So end users have the ability to determine trusted calculations, and it's a single source of truth. So by building measures within your semantic model, end users who connect to your semantic model will be able to strictly use the same calculation across many reports. So in that example, sales, oftentimes we see that sales could be calculated 15 different ways. By setting the measure within a measure table outside of all your tables today, it sets it at the top of your semantic model in the user side, but also sets the standard for how sales or any other measure or metric will be calculated. Next, I always say hide primary keys and organize dimensions. So as an end user, I don't want to see the join keys. We've set up the relationships that you see in this picture on the right. The dataset developer will define the relationships between the facts and the dimensions as they build out the semantic model. We can hide the key, where the primary keys are foreign keys, for those users, as they don't often provide any business detail in that. And we've set up those relationships. But then organize your dimensions with folders. So Power BI allows you to create folders within tables, and I'm air quoting folders. It's an organization technique to collapse or expand specific columns within a table that allow users to have a simpler ease of use. And I'm going to use, again, this client as an example. Their date dimension had 20 different columns with many different flags, but they rarely use those flags. So what we did is we put those flags into an indicators or a flags column and gave them their top 5 used columns, such as date, year, quarter, month, to really make it so that when you're in that drag and drop scenario, you're not searching for the characteristics or the dimension attributes you need. It's really there, and it makes dragging my sales measure in and my attributes about sales much simpler, and I'm not spending a lot of time searching the data set for the data I need. And last but not least, format all measures and sort dimension attributes. I always like to say that building the semantic model is really building that visualization, what the people will use in their visualization tool, and it is build it as if end users are displaying that. I want my numbers to have the right number of sig figs. I want dollar signs where appropriate. Go through the practice of setting that up, because again, self-service users will be much happier when the data looks and feels right and it's accurate. And then sort measures. So Power BI allows you to sort attributes by a given integer. And so sort your dates so that January, February, March are in order, et cetera. If you have other things, and you can add columns in your ETL process for other categories if you want certain levels. And I think that's a very important part of simplifying the use for self-service. And really, it's going to make utilization much more happy, because users know where to find the data they need and are able to self-serve a simple, clean semantic model. Carlos, do you have anything else to add about this simple semantic model?
No, but I'll talk about it in a slide here next, I think. And if Wayne, we have some questions, maybe, or if you might want to comment.
Yeah, let me insert one question here from Whitney, more of an organizational question. Do you have a centralized semantic model developer team, or is it decentralized and anyone in the business can develop? What do you see is recommended to be most successful?
let me take a shot at that. Maybe David has some comments too there. That's in today's environment, that's like $1 million question, I think, because there's a lot of talk about decentralization versus centralization in the way data is managed and used in organizations. And the truth is, in today's world, we're forced to decentralize because there's just too much to do. There's so much work to do out there that you can't have a centralized team, I think, deliver everything in a timely manner that's needed throughout the organization. On the other hand, is there need for some centralization? And I always believe there is. So the answer to that question in most organizations is that you have key semantic models that, like David's talked about, golden data sets that are centralized, that are developed and put together in such a way that they're certified by a business unit, let's say the financial business unit, and that golden data set is where finances come from. And because you don't want people on their own making up finance data. On the other hand, can everything be centralized? Well, we've done that. We've tried that before over the years. You know, the industry has tried to centralize data warehouses and things like that, and in the end, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work to provide one data store throughout the enterprise that provides every answer you may need in a timely manner. So the answer really is it's a little bit of both. Centralization is needed, and some centralized semantic models are needed, and then some semantic models can be managed by business units by themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in because, you know, when we work with organizations at the strategy level, the operating word is federated, right? You got to federate your operating model, you got to federate your architecture, you got to federate even your semantic models, like Carlos is saying. Because if you do just centralization or just decentralization, you're going to hit a lot of pain in short order. And, you know, most companies, when they hit that pain, they flip-flop to the other extreme, and then they just keep flip-flopping for years or decades. And so what you want is both in a coordinated, aligned way, as Carlos was talking about in this aligned model. But it really applies to almost anything you're doing in this space, from, you know, how you're organizing people and teams, you know, down to how you're organizing your semantics. One more question from Roman. For role-playing dimensions, would you create a calculated or a reference table over the base dimension like date? Does that make sense?
I think Roman, I believe your question is, would you use the calculated date dimension in Power BI, or build something within your data layer with date dimension? And my answer is date dimension is probably one of the most important dimensions within your organization, as every organization has specific dates, how they slice and dice their dates. So I would build a base dim date table and bring that in. Carlos may have more to that, but
I would say the same thing. I mean, the date dimension, well, there's a lot of common attributes across organizations. There's also many specific attributes, and I believe building it as in the data layer that can be used organizationally is really important.
Okay, why don't we move on? We've got about 14 minutes left in the session, so we're going to speed up a little bit.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead, Carlos.
I was going to say, and Whitney kind of followed up Roman's question, and she says, do we bring it in multiple times, or
yeah?
I think
for
that's
role-playing dimensions, right? I would bring it in multiple times and set up those specific relationships based on your role-playing, based on a key. So you would have that table look like it appears as many times as it's representing that role. So Wayne, I can go through this one pretty quickly. The age-old question, direct query versus import, will probably bring up many questions, but I think semantic models should reflect the data model. Try not to do, my big point here is Power BI is not an ETL tool. It's really that semantic layer that allows you to bring in data for that visualization purpose. And that will really, one, optimize your performance, but it will also help support self-service to multiple. My point also too is that will also help you optimize your semantic model to report ratio. if your semantic model represents the model you've built without any transformations within your layer, you should be able to support the business with many different types of reports. For security reasons, I always say leverage row-level security. Row-level security acts as a dimension. Many organizations say it's hard because they want to be able to log in and each user has specific access to that. I would say is if your data model answers the right business questions and they've limited specific regions, for example, setting up security groups. What I've found successful is using security groups and enabling them to have certain access to certain regions has been successful for row-level security. Another big challenge with self-service is how do you do source control? And so oftentimes I would say is Power BI does have 3 different versions of source control that they have allowed. The versions are different on different licenses you have. But my first recommendation is parameterize in your semantic model, parameterize databases or other parameters that may be changed if you are going to have to promote through different levels. And that can help create streamlining integration because you can build one semantic model and toggle the parameters as you deploy up. There are 2 different other versions. You can use either deployment pipelines if you have a premium account, or they've now recently come out with a PIBP, which is the Power BI project, where you can use something with like a Git integration or visual DevOps to have really that true CIDC source control. Those are both in preview mode, but if your organization is often working and have many data set developers, those recommendations, I recommend going down that path because it allows for seamless integration, but also allowing you to change and toggle. If you want to have someone build strictly in a dev database, all they have to do is change one parameter. Next is set semantic model storage methods by use case. This is an age-old question. What should I go, direct query versus import? You really could say versus the composite method where you use multiple. And in my scenario, I have found all 3 methodologies work great. If you have a smaller data set that's really there for speed, import method will work. However, oftentimes facts get large and you have a Power BI Pro license where you're limited to 1 gigabyte. Direct query works really well with the right curated data or modeled data. But the collaboration between the 2 might answer your question. So really balance what you need. Is it speed, performance, also with the ability to manage that. And that really, I won't say there is a right answer because it really does. There is no right answer. They both can meet the business needs. And last, I will say one really way to activate self-service is schedule regular meetups or knowledge sharing for self-service users to encourage usage. Where we found this successful is at a healthcare company we're working with is they schedule regular trainings with their power users to show new enhancements, demo enhancements, show what the analysts are doing as a whole to help build through how Power BI can help them with their job, as well as new enhancements and new data features. Carlos or Wayne, really those last 2 bullet points, do you all have any input on that, especially enabling self-service? Wayne, I know self-service has been a topic in your world for a long time. Is there other methodologies you just outside of Power BI encourage people for how to really get self-service going? And then Carlos, the direct query versus import question is always that age-old question.
I'll let Carlos talk about the direct query versus.
Well, I was going to say, I think that might be a whole topic in and of itself.
Yeah.
But direct query is important when data is needed, sometimes in pseudo or near real time. Sometimes if that's your only, if that's a requirement, then you need to implement good direct query processes. But direct query is also important when refreshes take a long time. Sometimes we might just refresh once a night, but the refresh takes hours and it fails, or you start getting changes to the underlying database that are undesirable. So often direct query is needed because the data size is too big as well. So it's a topic in and of itself. And if we had more time, I could go into it more. But again, there's always a balance there between, is it better to import, is it better to do direct query?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so David, to answer your question to me, and I'm going to also respond to a question from Andrew, who said he's done everything right in Power BI. He's got curated semantic models. They do have some adoption, but it just seems like there are people still struggling with self-serve with Power BI, and he wonders if it's the tool. Well, I would say, and I just delivered a 3-hour session on this yesterday on self-service. You really don't get true self-service. One, because it's something different for every user in your organization or every persona in your organization. Self-service means something different. But self-service really doesn't happen en masse until you've done everything else right, not just in Power BI, but you need the right operating model, the right data architecture, the right governance program, the right project management, the right product management, the right literacy program. All those things contribute to a really active, energetic, self-service environment. But you need everything in place because if you're missing one of those ingredients, things tend to bog down quite a bit. So why don't we move on? We're at the top of the hour here, so I think let's just finish with the slides here. And
so let me talk about this slide quickly because David mentioned a dimensional model, and we kind of labeled these green, yellow, and orange because none of these are bad. They're all useful. In fact, that's one of the strengths of Power BI, like we were saying earlier, is I can import and use any type of data, mostly any type of data in Power BI. So, if I have a need today and I need to get that data visible today, I can do that without a lot of engineering or modeling behind the scenes. But generally speaking, and the questions about self-service and curated data and dimensional and other modeling techniques, the dimensional model still seems to be the best approach for the self-service user, who is the average business user, what I call the people who need drag and drop usability. They can pick a measure that, like David showed, they have a measures table. They pick a few dimensions and they've got a report, they've got a dashboard that's actually correct without doing any coding. And that model still is the tried and true model for getting people like that up and running. On the other hand, a lot of organizations out there have what we call report tables or flatter data that they put together that serves a really good purpose. The report tables are often hierarchical in nature. They might have a region and a sub-region and some measures and an employee and a boss. And so essentially it can be reported on very, very well within Power BI there too. And it doesn't have to be modeled in any other way. What you lose with the report table concept is the joining across to other report tables, which can be more difficult. It's not set up necessarily to be related to any other data within the organization, although it can be with a little bit of DAX and a little bit of maybe filtering on import or things like that. But it's a very useful concept that can make Power BI powerful. That makes Power BI a good tool. And then the virtualized model. This is where you're using the data as is, but you're essentially transforming it on load so that it looks dimensional or looks like a report table to you. And sometimes that can be done within Power BI itself, or it can be done through views. So the data is not necessarily engineered and stored in any other way, but on demand and not when you need it in Power BI, you load it in such a way where it becomes much easier to use. And again, a very valid concept, especially for some quick wins. If you want to get something up and running quickly without a lot of back end work, building out a virtualized model can be really helpful. So I just wanted to talk about the modeling concepts and how they can all be useful in different ways.
Great, thanks. So we've got 2 more slides and about 4 minutes. So talk about apps.
Yeah, Wayne, and we've kind of touched in on this throughout the conversation, especially when we talked about workspaces. But Power BI report applications can be a great useful tool to encourage consumption and utilization within Power BI. This goes past the data sets and the semantic models. Once you've built your reports, Power BI can still be quite troublesome to navigate. especially for someone who might just want to look at what their sales were or what report is. So by building report applications, you can create a collection of both specific Workspace, but other documents. There might be a PDF that needs to be displayed for these users as well, or data catalog information that might be helpful, data dictionary that can be, you can add that to your application. And these can be used to distribute data for consumption only users who don't need that self-service. And really these users can have that simple place, that one-stop shop to get all their reports. And we find that to be much more easy for people who are just using that. And then on top of that, you can add additional security settings. Say there's 15 reports in a given workspace, but certain users can only see 5 or 6. You can set audience by that grouping of users. So when they log in, they see their 5 reports, but when you log in, you see your 10 reports. And by setting those specifics, you can really limit what people have access to in a given application.
That's cool. Very cool. All right, last slide, PBI tenant and monitoring.
Yeah, so I think this last one really, this ties almost everything together. I went on that approach that both performance and utilization start with that high level. How is your Power BI architecture set up? How are you utilizing it? How did you design it? Then we talked about the build aspect. You've built your Power BI, you've tested it, and you've deployed it for use. The last is really how are you going to manage, optimize, and monitor this? And so Power BI has several different tools already in place for you to do that. Wayne, as you mentioned, Power BI should have built-in reporting. They have feature usage and adoption report within the admin tenant. It doesn't give the details of who's using what exactly, but it can provide some high-level stats on how what reports are being interacted with and some of that. If you have the capacity level, you can leverage detail like that. Within a given report, you can get single usage metrics on a given report in a given workspace. However, if you want to build that full monitoring system that we talked about, what we implement in our assessments is you can leverage Power BI REST APIs to get much more metadata about that and set that admin monitoring process up to really make sure and maintain your environment so that it doesn't get out of hand.
Oh, great.
I do see some questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, why don't we go over some of those that we didn't cover quickly?
The first one is, will this recording be available? Yeah. We will send this out in the next day or two, I believe, with both the slide deck and the recording.
And one of the things we do want to say, we'd love for you guys, anybody on this webinar, to reach out to us if you need any help or assistance. We're always just willing to talk. Sometimes people just want to talk about the problems they have and they have nowhere to go to. And so, we like to make sure we support the community out there. And if we can help you out in any ways, we'd love to do that. There are 1 or 2 more questions, David, and I don't know if you want to address those.
Yeah. Whitney's asking again, any last minute tips and tricks when trying to rein back self-service overload, too many data sets and reports, data silos? Whitney, we found it beneficial to really take that high level look on what's out there and what's being used. So using some of that data from the both monitoring side within Power BI, but also building and taking some of the REST APIs to get that data, and then you can start programmatically actually removing them. The REST API allows you to do that.
And one more question I see here: is there a way to pull model refresh status?
The Power BI REST API does have that information, so it's under the admin refresh status, I believe.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions left. So at this
do
point,
we have? I was just going to say, Whitney had, I think, one more we didn't address. Do you have any certification processes for developers?
Oh yeah, we
Either semantic model developers or report developers, in order for them to get a license to publish and share.
Whitney, we actually worked directly with a client who recently pushed out a training program where the Power users have to take a test on how to use the system and how they get their data sets certified. And we've actually found that's been rather successful. And we've worked closely with them to set up that training process with their team.
Was it a self-created test?
It was
I think
self-created.
that, yeah, self-created, I believe on that.
Any thoughts on how OLAP cubes could be used to optimize performance? People don't want to let you guys go.
Yeah, I know. We're kind of over the overtime, but you know what? I'd love to answer that one because the Power BI semantic model is an OLAP cube. And often if you're creating another OLAP cube, you're doing the same thing twice. Now, some people may have OLAP cubes that are built in non-Microsoft tools or non-Microsoft products, and they ingest those into Power BI, which is fine. But essentially, if you have a Microsoft OLAP cube, like say a Microsoft Analysis Services cube, and you're ingesting it into a Power BI semantic model, you're essentially building the same thing twice. So my suggestion often is try to move everything into the semantic model. If you're dependent on OLAP cubes because you have legacy, a lot of cubes that have been built out over time and they're important and it's hard to change things. The OLAP cube techniques for optimizing performance are almost the same as they are for the Power BI semantic model. Some of the things David talked about, make sure the cube is properly modeled, make sure you don't have to create a lot of columns on the fly, calculated columns. You don't have to do a lot of DAX. The cube delivers the information it needs to deliver as is the best response to having an OLAP cube be optimized. And I think we got through most of the questions at this point.
It looks like there was a question that Dan asked in Q&A.
Well, I think we answered that. If he's referring to the one about data workspaces versus BI workspaces, we did address that one.
His question is, a lot of end users' needs are cross-departmental in nature and are based on integrated data. There is increasing interest in data products. Where do these fit in terms of Workspace's general architecture, including the so-called marketplace? Carlos, you might have a good quick answer to that one.
Well, I was actually going to throw that out one at Wayne more than me, I felt, because I think Wayne's done a lot of work in data products and a lot of research in that area.
Funny, I don't see that question.
I just don't know that. I mean, I guess in my mind, just purely technology point of view, I see workspaces as being one thing and data products as being something else, right? And the concept of a data product, I think, is an important concept, and it's a concept that we're going to see more and more, I think, in the future. But I think the management of workspaces I would separate from the management or the creation of data products. That would be at least my quick view on that. So
couldn't you assign a workspace for all your data products if you have a more content approach?
Yeah, that would probably be the way you do it, right? As you say, here's where I'm going to deliver data products to, and put that in a workspace where people have access to that. But again, I don't think that's a real data product solution, right? Where I subscribe to certain data from different departments and it's delivered to me, when I need it, and things like that, right? And
probably more appropriate if you want one place for people to go to get standardized reports, right? That get approved. I've heard of that a lot. But for a data products, especially, I mean, the whole point of a data product in a data marketplace is to share core data assets across silos or across pretty distinct domains, even externally. So usually you want something more specific, more tuned to that kind of interchange. So yeah, we recommend data marketplaces for that, both internally or externally for data sharing. Okay. I think that's it. I must have missed a few. We got quite a bit. So thank you all in the audience for tuning in, asking great questions and making good comments. And I want to thank Carlos and Dave for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.